Ahoy Captain, and welcome to the EU ETS Masterclass for the maritime industry. In this video we will tell you everything that we know, everything that you need to know for the maritime industry with regards to EU ETS, and also how to comply in the most cost-effective manner using or not using the free-to-use calculator. But if there's one thing that you should know, just one, it is that if you have to comply with EU ETS as a ship owner, ultimately by 2038 or 2050, maybe later, but ultimately you will have to be carbon neutral. That does not mean you have to be zero emissions, but under the rules of the EU ETS system, ultimately all carbon emissions will go down to zero. We'll explain everything in detail in the masterclass itself, which will consist of the following 4 chapters. The first chapter will be everything about EU ETS, in which I will explain how the outlook will be, what you have to do as a ship owner, etc., and how it all works and how the requirements work. Secondly, we will show you how to calculate EU ETS for yourself. Don't worry, you don't have to do it for yourself because we have a free-to-use calculator. Thirdly, the costs and impact, also with historic prices and projections towards the future, and of course our Decarbonizer tool that will help you decide the most cost-effective solution for your ship. And we'll finish with the frequently asked questions using our RegulAitor tool. Before we dive into it, however, a few disclaimers from our part. First of all, the masterclass itself is comprehensive but not complete, and that's just a fancy way of saying we cannot cram everything into a masterclass of just half an hour, 45 minutes. I will refer to the guide quite a few times and have a look at what we have in terms of material on our website as well, because there you can always find more. Secondly, it is ship type but not ship specific. We don't have your ship details, so I cannot say anything for certain, but that's why we have our tools. You can put in your ship details there and everything will be calculated for you. Thirdly, it is subject to change, especially this regulation, especially because the prices are constantly changing, but also the requirements from time to time. So please keep in mind that ultimately you have to double check with your verifier. We are not a verifier, and that brings me to the last point. We are independent, not a verifier. We do work with our preferred verifier, Normec Verifavia, which can help you with all the verifications that you need. But this masterclass itself and the work that we do is done independently to give you the most cost-effective advice possible. And how do we do it? Well, at any point, just when watching this masterclass or when you are on our website, at any point at all, you are free to contact the help desk to make your life easier. All the help that you need, all the clarifications and everything that you think is wrong or maybe faulty, just click on the contact help desk button and we will be there to help you and guide you on your way. But that being said, and without further ado, let's dive into the first part on EU ETS. Everything you need to know about EU ETS. And I always like to start with the bigger picture. What is it? Why is it especially? So EU ETS stands for the European Emission Trading System, which basically all boils down to just one thing. One allowance gives you the right to emit 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent. And it basically means that for every metric ton of CO2 equivalent that you emit, you have to buy one allowance and give that to the EU under the EU ETS system, emission trading system. As you noticed, sometimes we say EU ETS system, EU ETS, it's all a bit intermingled, but it boils down to this simple fact. And officially it is what we call a cap and trade system, based on a cap and trade principle, which means that there is a certain cap, a certain amount of emissions allowed in the EU, and everybody who falls under the jurisdiction of EU ETS has to comply to that specific cap. So there's a maximum amount of emissions under EU ETS. So how does it look like? The maximum currently is about, let's have a look, a little bit over 1400 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and the maximum cap will be gradually reduced, going all the way up to, well, let's say between 2036, 8-ish, 40 and 2058, depending on different proposals that are currently under review by the European Commission. So when we have a look at this specific graph, we see two things. One, it's about emitting CO2, and two, it will all ultimately go down, and that's what I meant earlier. Eventually, whether it's 2036 or 2058, the amount of emissions that are allowed to be emitted under the EU ETS system per year will be zero. So everybody who has to comply with this system, and especially ship owners of course, cannot emit CO2 equivalent anymore. So that means you have to either use something that's zero emission or absorbing the emissions like carbon capture and storage. And I know this is really far down the road, but well, ultimately we have to take this into account, and it can affect your ship if your ship is still sailing in 20 years. And the timeline that you see here is the shortest timeline that is proposed at the moment. If you are thinking of sailing around in 2050, something to take into account. My personal estimate is that it probably will be more like the 2058 timeline for maritime industry. I'm guessing that we're gonna make some exemptions, but who knows. So this is the big picture, and the cap and trade principle does not really work well with the maritime industry, because normally under EU ETS companies get a certain amount of allowances per year. And if they are below those allowances, so they emit less than they projected, they can trade those allowances with other companies for money. But for ship owners, they simply have to pay taxes, you could say. Well, it's not really taxes, they have to pay allowances, but it's best comparable to a tax in effect. So this is the bigger picture for the entire EU ETS system in the whole of the European Union. Let's dive into the maritime aspect. And what we see here is quite a lot of information. So we have different scopes in terms of ship sizes and types, categories. We have different greenhouse gases that will be taken into account, and we have a so-called phase-in. And on the x-axis we go from 2023 and 4, which is sort of in the past, and then moving ahead in the future, you see that more ship sizes and types will be included going further towards the future. And you see also the white and the blue parts. The white part means you only have to measure under the EU monitoring, reporting and verification system. But if you are part of the MRV system, then ultimately you will also fall under the EU ETS scope. So right now it's only cargo and passenger ships, but smaller sized ships between 400 and 5,000 GTs will be included from 2027 onwards, and offshore ships will also be included from 2027 onwards. And also greenhouse gases, more greenhouse gases will be included, which basically means your emission factor will be higher and you have to pay more for allowances or pay more allowances. Right now it's only CO2, but it will include methane and nitrous oxide. So methane slip, especially for LNG engines, will become more important. 2024, that's when it starts for the ship types specified here. And then first you have to surrender 40% of the allowances. So if you officially have to surrender 100 allowances, remember 100 tons of CO2 equivalent, then in 2025 actually you have to surrender them for 2024. So the year after it's 40 tons and then 70 tons and then 100 tons. So slowly it will become more and more. Don't worry, I'll show you all in the calculations how that works going ahead for different ship types. That being said, however, we do have a nice overview of all the ship types as we categorize them and which ones are included. But please check with your verifier to make sure that your ship type is indeed the one specified by the regulations. I'll say this a few times going ahead as well, but if we go back here, we see EU MRV and EU ETS. Basically, there's a lot of, well, I wouldn't say gray area, but the regulations refer to each other a lot. MRV is really the monitoring system, reporting system, verification system. and that determines how everything is measured, but also how the emissions are calculated. And the EU ETS system is basically the system that tells you those amount of emissions as per the MRV system has to be paid or have to be paid under the EU ETS scope for these specific ship types for different kinds of sizes. And then there is one more thing in terms of the voyage itself. You don't have to pay everything when going out and from the EU. So this is all for ship sizes, etc. So if you're sailing from and to the EU, only 50% of your voyage emissions have to be paid. And if you're sailing inside the EU, then 100% of the emissions have to be paid. And if you're sailing outside of the EU, you're lucky. You don't have to pay anything, of course. So each voyage, a certain amount of emissions will be calculated, port of call, port of end call, and then between those ports, the emissions as per the MRV system will be verified by verifier, and then those will have to be paid for each year, well actually the year after. So you're noticing there's a lot of information and there's a lot of things happening over time. So how does it look exactly? Well, there are a few dates that are very important each year. The 28th of February, the 31st of March, and the 30th of September. So the last day of February, you have to verify all the information to your verifier. They are the ones who are gonna check it. So you compile all your information and then it's brought to the verifier. This is then compiled by the verifier into a company emissions data verification report. It can also be done by yourself, but it has to be verified by the verifier. And then on the 31st of March, it needs to be the aggregated data needs to be emitted, submitted to the administering authority. So that is the EU flag state that you have to comply to. And then finally, almost, let's say half a year later, you have to pay for the allowances of that year before when everything is verified. And of course, before that, we also need to include all the individual ships data into that fleet report. And well, I'm guessing, or I'm assuming right now that all the things that need to be done beforehand, that means setting up your monitoring plan for EU MRV and the rest of the plans which have to be verified by verifier, that's all done, but that only has to be done once or when you have very specific or important changes to your ships, or with new ships of course. But the points that I just now mentioned, so first aggregating data, sending that to verifier, verifier sending that to the administering authority, and then ultimately surrendering the allowances. It basically means the same as paying for those allowances, paying the taxes. You just have to pay for the emissions emitted. So these are the different dates. Now let's have a look at the full requirements as per the guide and of course the regulations as we have them. So this is not really a summary, it is way more than a summary, but it compiles all the most important requirements for different scopes and organizations. So first of all, we have the shipping company requirements, the EU MRV monitoring plan requirements, the emissions report requirements each year, and of course the requirements that, or the things that the verifier has to do. Firstly, the company needs to register to the correct member state. How and which member states, that's explained in the guide. That could be a masterclass in and of itself. You need to open a MOA account in order to trade the different allowances. You need to submit the monitoring plan for each vessel within 3 months of the first port of call of that vessel entering the EU. You also, like I said, need to submit the emissions report, the ER, to the administering authority by March 31st annually. And then you also need to surrender the allowances of the previous year by September 30th by September latest. And then we have the monitoring plan requirements. Those are most specific, but those are all explained under the EU MRV regulations, regulatory guidelines. Basically you have your ship information and the shipping company information. You need to explain the sources of energy used on board in navigation and at berth from the different ports of calls, the procedures on how you monitor it, and you have a few different kinds available. There are deviations, of course, but typically it's you can pick a few. You need to monitor departure and arrival times, date and time, obviously, of those different port of calls. The procedures for monitoring the well-to-tank and tank-to-wake emission factors and how to calculate them, those are also explained in EU MRV. We'll cover those in quite explicit detail later on. The standards and characteristics of shore power and zero-emission technologies needs to be explained in your monitoring plan as well. The value of the established total electrical power, if any, needs to be monitored there too. And of course, it shall be updated and assessed by the verifier as appropriate. So if you have big refits, you probably need to update your monitoring plan as well. All data needs to be reported to ETS MRV. That's the platform operated by EMSA. So they collect all the information, and that's also where the information of the verifier needs to be sent to. Then the emissions report themselves. Those need to be collected, of course, and then sent to ETS. It's based on voyages, so port of call, date and time. So basically at the end of the year you get a lot of line items with all the different monitoring points, etc. That's all collected and added up. The amount of fuel used during those voyages and the amount of electricity, if any. So basically all the energy that you have used for your entire year for those different ships. And then finally, the verifier has to make sure that that all the different reports are checked before February 28th. Those will be aggregated, all those reports, into a final report before the end of March and then sent to the appropriate administering authority via ETS MRV. And those are the most important steps that the verifier needs to do. So basically checking that all the data is correct and making sure that you don't have to change or append your monitoring plan. And that is it for the informative part. Now let's move on to part 2, a calculation, where we show you the emission factors and how to calculate and forecast EU ETS emissions and ultimately costs. The calculation itself boils down to calculating the amount of allowances that you have to surrender, which means you have to calculate your CO2 equivalent footprint, which means that you have to make sure that you get the correct emission factors for the fuel that you use. Let me show you. The basic formula is quite simple. 1 allowance in euros equals the right to emit 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent, metric tons, which is fuel consumed multiplied by the correct emission factors. And here we get into the nitty-gritty, because for each engine, each fuel type, and as we saw earlier, different ship type, different emission factors, different phase in, blah blah blah. So then we get all into the nitty-gritty, but basically you have fuel multiplied with an emission factor, and that results into a CO2 equivalent factor. So we look at the MRV greenhouse gas emissions, that is CO2, carbon dioxide, CH4, methane, and also methane slip, that's the second one, and N2O, dinitrous oxide, or also laughing gas, if I'm not mistaken. So when we burn fuel, we get these different types of emissions, which need to be included if we look at 2027 or 2026. I have to look it up myself and ahead. We also have to take slippage into account for LNG, also explained in Annex 1. And then finally, you don't have to calculate anything by yourself. You can use our quick scans in order to calculate everything. Well, not calculate everything. Let's first have a look at the different formulas as stated in Annex 1 in the MRV regulations. Those are the following. So we take the equivalent greenhouse gas footprint by taking the amount of CO2 plus the amount of CH4 multiplied with the global warming potential of CH4 plus the amount of N2O multiplied with the global warming potential of N2O. And if we look more closely, we see that CO2 is of course the masses of all the different fuels summed up per engine and the different kinds of fuel that we have. We subtract the amount of slippage, if we have any. That only applies to LNG engines or similar types engines, and we multiply it with the emission factor of CO2 of that respective fuel. For CH4 or methane, it's slightly more complicated because there we can have slippage. So we take again the same stuff, amount of fuel consumed minus or subtracting the slippage multiplied with the emission factor of CH4 for that specific fuel, plus the amount of slippage in terms of CH4, LNG. And then finally the same applies to N2O. And then we multiply the emissions of CO2, CH4 and N2O with the respective global warming potential values, because CH4 and N2O have a higher global warming potential compared to CO2. Let me give an example to show you how this works using LNG. In this example, we're going to take 1 metric ton of fuel and going to combust it using a diesel engine. We're going to take the same calculations and formulas. So here we see them, and now we're just going to input them as per the regulations. So for 1 metric ton of fuel and a slippage coefficient of 0.2% and an emission factor of CO2 for LNG of 2.75, we get the following in terms of CO2. So that's 2.7445 metric tons CO2 emitted. For methane, CH4, we get, of course, slippage part, but because for this particular engine and LNG the emission factor is 0, but we do have to add the total amount of slippage, that is the uncombusted amount of LNG from the engine. And then finally the same applies to N2O, so the combusted part multiplied with the emission factor of N2O. This is all summed, multiplied with the greenhouse global warming potential factor, and that we do here. So we take these amounts, and because the global warming potential factor of CO2 is 1, we multiply it with 1, but we don't have to show that here. We get the following: 1 metric ton in this case will lead to 2.8296 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, which also means we have to surrender about 2.9 or almost 3 allowances for burning 1 metric ton of LNG. And as you can see, especially when we have multiple fuels, multiple ships, multiple engines, different blah blah blah, it becomes quite complicated indeed, and you don't want to do this by yourself. And that's what we have our quick scan for and other tools. But before I show you this, I wanted to show you the emission factors that we currently use for doing all these calculations, because it's important to note, as you see, that, well, different emission factors will lead to very different CO2 equivalent factors. So here we have a list of all different kinds of fuels, also biofuels and renewable fuels of non-biological origin that we use, and in some cases the assumptions that lead to the emission factors that you just now saw in the LNG example. So in our tools you can adjust these accordingly. We update them when more information becomes available, but always check with your verifier or have to verify make these calculations, because they need to provide their stamp of approval. And in some cases you also need to provide your proof of sustainability of the fuel provider in case that these fuels, the fuels that you use, are not specified by the regulator. And there's one more thing left to say about the emission factors before we dive into the quick scan itself, and that's the emission factors for biofuels and renewable fuels of non-biological origin. And I'm going to take some excerpts directly from the regulations, because man oh man, they make it so complicated that sometimes, as you might have noticed, I cannot even remember everything. But it boils down to the fact that if you have a biofuel, as per the Renewable Energy Directive or approved by that framework, then the emission factor of CO2 alone, under the EU ETS will be 0. So it will be greatly reduced. To be eligible for such a 0 rating, you have to have a certain level of reduction compared to fossil fuels and also comply with the rules set in the Renewable Energy Directive. And the exact treatment of renewable fuels of non-biological origin and recycled carbon fuels, those are not clearly stated yet. They will be developed pursuant to, I believe, Article 14 of the EU ETS Directive, but currently we take into account that these will be 0 rated, so make sure to take that into account as well. So we assume an emission factor of CO2 for these types of fuels of 0, just as with biofuels, but the slippage coefficient and the other emission factors of CH4 and N2O, those are not 0 rated, or at least we do not 0 rate them in our calculation. So that means that for biofuels, in some cases you can get a very low amount of EU ETS. So enough talking about calculations, let's do some calculations, just show you how it can be done. Here we have the EU ETS quick scan, so that's a way to quickly surmise the amount of EU ETS and fuel you will have to pay in the years ahead. And I'm first gonna change the amount of ships to 1 to make it clear. The reporting year, our starting year, will simply be 2024 because we have to pay the amount of allowances of 2024 in 2025. EU ETS price has been hovering around 65 euros or slightly, well, it's going down now a bit for about half a year, so we're just going to leave it at that. But well, basically if you increase it, then of course the pricing increase, that's simple. And there you see we have EU ETS, fuel cost and total. So if we want, we can also add fuel costs, because coupled with the different parameters that we have for these kinds of fuels, we will get a better estimate of the combined fuel cost with EU ETS to get the most cost effective solution. But in this case, for a tanker, 5000 GTs plus, of course, which with HFO, 10,000 metric tons, we're going to change this 1 metric ton, and then also 0 tons of MDO. And then you can see here, this is the amount of EU ETS to be paid in 2024, and then moving ahead in the follow-up years, you can see the amount is multiplied there. So this is the amount as per the recent calculations for this type of fuel. And here you also see the exact reason why we build these kinds of tools, because, well, if you change the EU ETS price, everything else will change accordingly. A reporting year, you want to have a fleet, you want to compare emission factors to different fuels that you use, you want to change the fuel prices there as well. And then ultimately we combine this into a yearly overview for the different ships. And if you want, you can download an Excel version to calculate all those things for yourself, or maybe change some of the parameters as per your personal preference. But this is the EU ETS quick scan as we use it, and this helps us to get an overview of a small sized fleet and the EU ETS costs over the coming years. Feel free to download the tool and use it for yourself. Also ask questions to the regulator, but that we will do at the end. So this covers all the calculations that you need. Just remember, it's fuel multiplied with the correct emission factors, summing all the voyages and ships, and that leads to the total amount of allowances or CO2 equivalent footprint. So now let's dive into the real important part, which is how to most cost effectively comply with Fuel EU. So everything about costs and impact. Let's first have a look and see how much it costs to comply for a regular vessel, as far as there is a regular vessel, and then also what would be the cost for non-compliance, and also costs moving forward, and especially the most cost-effective solutions to mitigate EU ETS, meaning you save more than you have to pay. Here we have a very brief overview of EU ETS for a tanker that consumes about 10,000 metric tons of fuel, HFO, and 1,000 metric tons of MDO. So it's a blend of two different fuels. Using the Fuel EU quick scan, we can easily see that with the current EU ETS price, we would pay approximately, well, roughly over 2 million euros per year when we are sailing fully in the EU. That is the amount of money that we have to pay in terms of surrendering allowances in order to comply with EU ETS on the regular market, that is the EEX market. I'll get to it shortly. What happens if we do not pay or surrender these allowances and we are non-compliant? Well, a few things can happen. Firstly, the company names will be published, naming and shaming, exactly. So people will see if there are any companies that are non-compliant. There is a €100 penalty for each ton of metric CO2 equivalent emitted, for which no allowances were surrendered. So right now that would mean 1.5 times the additional cost of the allowances. And then finally, failure to comply for 2 consecutive methods could result in an expulsion order. That means that you cannot sail in the EU anymore, or any EU port for that matter. This is worst case, and it remains to be seen if this is really enacted, because right now, of course, we're just entering the first year of EU ETS. Assuming that you pay your allowances, that you pay your carbon taxes. We just saw an example for a single ship that consumes quite a lot of heavy fuel oil. What does it mean per different type of fuel? We made an overview, and of course it very much depends on the EUA, that is the European allowance price, so the price for one allowance, so the right to emit 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. But we've made it easy for you, looking ahead 2027 and further beyond, and stating that the price is €100. At that point, you see that this is roughly the additional costs per metric ton of this kind of fuel. And you see there's a big difference in biofuels and of course regular fossil fuels. Methanol, that's a bit of an outlier in the sense that, well, considering it's an alternative fuel, still regular methanol as opposed to biomethanol makes a very big difference. Bio-LNG here can still be quite a lot in the case that we have high slippage factors. So if you have lower slippage factors, that will decrease, but this is an example just simply stating that even if you have bio-LNG with high slippage factors, you could still be paying a lot for EU ETS. Use the quick scan to change the fuel prices and have a look at how it would reflect on your vessels, fleet, etc. So key component here in the cost impact, as you can see, is the EU allowance price. So what was the price historically, and what are people saying that the prices will be in the future? If we have a look at the historic prices of the European Energy Exchange, I believe that's what EEX stands for, we see that historically the prices were actually quite low. So for 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent, you paid well below 20 euros per metric ton. But that was because there was an oversupply and demand was low. Basically, there were too many allowances in the system. Those were decreased, and now you see prices going up, higher demand, lower supply, and well, in the last year it again went down. So then it was the opposite reaction, more supply, less demand. So that's just market forces working for you folks. What is expected is that ultimately, and I think this graph shows it as well, most other sources out there expect prices to rise. It ranges between 200 to 300 up to 400 and 500 all the way to 2050. Looking back at the beginning, where we saw that ultimately the total amount will go to zero. That means almost no supply. That means probably high demand. So then prices will go up significantly in the case that there is still allowances needed to be sold. If not, if everybody decarbonizes perfectly, of course, prices will either even go down, decrease, or remain roughly the same. My personal guess is that prices can, well, skyrocket, go up quite a lot, but as with the historic prices here, you can see it goes in peaks. So probably it goes up, goes down, but I'm expecting there to be prices of, well, at some point maybe €1,000 per metric ton equivalent, but that will be sporadically and well beyond in the future. But you know, perhaps you can quote me on this in the future in case I'm wrong as well. If you see that a 10x multiple currently is historically possible, then I'm guessing 10 times more than the current or the all-time high is also possible in the next 30 years, or maybe a little less. So we are personally working with the actual prices, but in all our tools and forecasting, you can simply input future prices, your own scenarios, etc. Okay, so these are the prices. We've seen that we have about, with the current rates, 2 times or €200 per metric ton of fossil fuel, roughly additional costs. So what would be the most cost-effective solution to comply with the EU ETS system? In order to determine the most cost-effective solution, we currently recommend using the Decarbonizer and not the EU ETS quick scan, but that's mostly because the EU ETS quick scan does allow you to change the type of fuel. For example, we can have a look and see what the different fuels will, how the different fuels will impact your EU ETS, and you can see here that it will be a lot lower. But if you include fuel price, typically the costs are a lot higher for biofuels. So there is no such thing as price parity. Currently, biofuels and different kinds of fuels simply do not outweigh the benefits that you get with using EU ETS. So we probably have to look at different decarbonization measures, and if we have a look at the list, at the moment, shore power, also wind propulsion and hull coating are the most obvious candidates in most cases. Also because, well, hull coating simply saves you, a proper hull coating saves you a lot of fuel, but wind propulsion also gives you a much needed advantage for fuel EU. So you can use the decarbonizer here to quickly have a look and see for yourself what it would do for your ship parameters. You can change around here, add more power to, for example, wind propulsion, and see if you can get even more benefits with regards to the day rate and reduced EU ETS. Basically, it's reduced fuel consumption, meaning reduced EU ETS costs. But we have prepared for you two different case studies, one using wind propulsion and one using hull coatings. Let me just share with you the results. What we mean by a hull coating is that we apply a special coating that reduces friction and thus fuel consumption. So basically we have an investment cost, a capex for the hull coating per square meter, applying it. Generally that's done in dry dock. And then you can see that the overall day rate for this specific hull coating that we use from subsea industries, EcoSpeed, reduces your day rate with quite a lot. This is the overall day rate for a generalized example that we've simply used the decarbonizer for. And then the EU ETS savings, the specific savings, as you can see here, are almost 840 euros per day. So the payback time is within a year. This is typical for these kinds of systems. They are very effective, but they are generally only advisable to specific ship types with specific operations that either can clean their hulls on a regular basis, or, for example, ice class vessels that regularly sail through ice so that the hull is cleaned and scraped by the ice itself. So it has operational disadvantages, but in terms of cost savings, it's one of the best things that you can do because it greatly reduces your fuel consumption. Another thing, wind assisted propulsion, as you can see here, a bit more costly, especially if we want to get more fuel reduction for the ship type that we chose. That was a similar tanker that we use throughout the masterclass, but also the guide. You can see that the overall day rate is reduced quite a lot. We actually achieved the same level of EU ETS savings, but the overall payback time is longer because the capex costs are higher. What you can do is simply use the decarbonizer to input your ship parameters and specifics, maybe change the capex where needed, and then you can instantly see, as you can see on the right hand side, the conventional and the EU ETS cost after the measures have been applied, in this case wind propulsion. And if you need our help to make a business case for your ship, just feel free to reach out to us and we'll help you anytime. And that concludes the cost reduction part, which for the most part is all about reducing fuel consumptions. Currently we do not see biofuels or other type of fuels greatly impacting a business case or a profitable business case with respect to EU ETS. Well, fuel prices are normally higher than the added benefits for EU ETS, so we need to look at prevention measures to simply reduce the combustion of fuel. That's it. Less fuel consumed is less EU ETS. So let's have a look at a few of the frequently asked questions that we get with the through the RegulAitor and on the help desk. All the frequently asked questions are on the regulations main page for EU ETS. You simply scroll down and there you have it. These are the most frequently asked questions for EU ETS, but I can imagine you have more, so you can simply use the RegulAitor AI, as you can see here. I've prepared a question today. We got one, who is responsible for compliance with EU ETS regulations, so especially ship owner versus ship manager, blah blah blah. So if you input the value here, then of course it's well, basically an open AI GPT, you could say, but we have included all the different sources, not just to the regulations, but also our Fuel EU ETS guides, all the regulatory guides, etc. So here you see which, in this case, the shipping companies that are responsible, and I believe that, well, this is a very brief answer because there's a whole section on how shipping company is defined, but hey, we can always have a look here and open the EU MRV directive. Let's see, there we go, and then we can simply scroll down to the applicable pages. And if you're not happy with the result, you can always contact a person directly. There you go, and here you can answer, or you can ask the question directly, and we can help you answer those questions that you do not find good answers for. So either way, we're just one click away. Finally, I've mentioned it a few times, but all the information in the masterclass and all the references that we used can be found here in the EU ETS guide. As you can already see, a lot of it is familiar, but here it is in a lot more detail and text. And at any point you can simply download the guide to, well, have a look at it for yourself. This guide will be updated constantly as the EU ETS regulation evolves, and then also all the latest information will be reflected here, and of course in all the tools, etc. So this is the place for you to find more information in the future. And that is all we know about EU ETS at the moment. In a nutshell, I wanted to say, but that is not true because it took us quite some time to explain you everything. Also because we want to show you in detail how we not only do the calculations, but how we can come up with the most cost-effective solution to reduce costs for your vessel. So if you need more help with clarifying EU ETS, anything at all, building a business, whether it's building a business case or simply needing more information to clarify things, simply contact the help desk at any time to make your life easier. Thanks for watching the video, enjoy calculating EU ETS, and have a great day.